I have admittedly become a bit obsessed with the fact that so many of our fellow workers across the country are basically living in what we have chillingly come to call sacrifice zones. A place where people live that is being polluted by private industry or by government operations.
What I also witnessed was a government that wasn't respecting trade unions. They don't have a system of social dialogue. They were not involving trade unions in the meetings. They're happy to meet me, but they didn't want to meet the trade unions in Ukraine. And that's wrong.
In general, there are toxic and hostile work environments within the Postal Service. Would I say it's all? No, but it is a pandemic.
A lot of civil rights advocates and legal scholars have been sounding the alarm about is actually the trend towards resegregation. Schools in which students are racially isolated, where one race is a majority of the students in that school.
If we're having this, not just an adversarial relationship, but a litigious relationship with Union Pacific and BNSF, that it could derail plans for, oh, look at that pun, that was so cute. Derail plans for how we want to roll out passenger rail and mountain rail in Colorado.
You're listening to the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, our weekly selection of highlights from a few shows from the more than 200 that are now in the Labor Radio Podcast Network. You'll find them all at laborradionetwork.org. I'm Chris Garlock. This week's featured shows are Working People, a podcast by, for, and about the working class today. LabourStart, the official podcast of LabourStart, the news and campaigning website of the International Trade Union Movement. Fed Up, a podcast for federal employees who are fed up with non-compliance in an unjust system and who are fed up with constantly being mistreated, misinformed, and or misrepresented. School Me, a podcast fueled by educators. And our final segment, Labor Exchange, Colorado's only labor-focused radio show airing on KGNU Community Radio, featuring interviews about current challenges facing workers. That's all ahead on this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Here's the show.
My name is David Jones. I've lived in the community of Curtis Bay for over 35 years. I had friends that were taken away in the middle of the night that lived in Wagner's Point and Fairfield because their houses were bought out by industry because of eminent domain and because industry was more important than these neighborhoods.
My name is Tiffany. I feel good about my community because we come together and we're supportive of each other, and we are continuing to battle the hazardous health conditions that we face, that many people like Dave and Angie have faced for over 30 years.
Hi, my name is Carlos Sanchez. I am a youth leader in the community of Lakeland, which is a neighboring community in Curtis Bay.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and made possible by the support of listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and we've got another doozy of an episode for y'all today. I have admittedly become a bit obsessed with the fact that so many of our fellow workers across the country are basically living in what we have chillingly come to call sacrifice zones. Normally, the term sacrifice zone is used to describe a place where people live that is being polluted by private industry or by government operations. But the more that I look into this, the more obvious it becomes that the whole swaths of the country, including in our major cities, are basically right now in the process of being sacrificed. especially when you count communities that are already feeling the devastating impacts of climate change, and they're basically being left to fend for themselves. Because from the forever chemicals and microplastics that are literally inside all of us right now, to the poisonous coal ash tailings pools and factory farm manure lakes that are sitting next to homes across the country, hits close to home for me. Because, I am talking to my Baltimore neighbors here. Folks who, as you heard, live in Curtis Bay, Mount Winans, and other parts of South Baltimore. Like about a 15-minute drive from the Real News Network studio that I am sitting in right now. We'll see y'all back here next week for another episode of Working People. And if you cannot wait that long, then just go subscribe to our Patreon and check out the awesome bonus episodes that we've got there waiting for you. I'm Maximilian Alvarez. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Solidarity forever.
When my face you no longer see, I live on, yes, I live on. Wherever we go, we are going to roll the Union on the song. I live on, yes, I live on. Wherever hungry are we. Just as hungry can be. The song, I live on, yes, I live on. Where mean things are happening in this land, it's read a song. I live on, yes, I live on. Wherever the book mean things are happening in this land is read, I live on, yes, I live on. Wherever the videotape of me is shown, I live on, yes, I live on. If I have help to make this a better world to live in, I'll live on, yes, I'll live on. When my body is silent and in some lonesome grave, I live on, yes, I live on. When my songs and poems are read, I live on, yes, I live on.
Hello, this is Eric Lee, and this is another LabourStart podcast. And this week, we're very pleased to have with us the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, Esther Lynch. Esther, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Eric. Thanks for giving us an opportunity to discuss with you today.
Thanks, Esther. Now, I wanted to move us away slightly from the European Union to ask you about Ukraine, because you recently convened a meeting with European and Ukrainian trade union leaders, I think, in Poland. What are the next steps to build solidarity with workers and their unions in Ukraine?
That meeting came out of an earlier meeting. I had been invited by the trade unions in Ukraine to go and visit them last year at the end of the year, and I did that. And when I was there, what I witnessed was inspiring work by trade unions, very relevant both on the front line, but in the everyday reality of working people in Ukraine. But Eric, what I also witnessed was a government that wasn't respecting trade unions. They don't have a system of social dialogue. They were not involving trade unions in the meetings. They're happy to meet me, but they didn't want to meet the trade unions in Ukraine. And that's wrong. Because even the International Labour Organization has said that's wrong. The European Commission has said this is not how Ukraine can join the European Union. What's absolutely critically important is that you respect trade unions and social dialogue, bona fide trade unions. That's an important factor. So the meeting in Poland was a follow-up to that. And the reason that meeting in Poland was so important is because there's resources now going to the reconstruction. And there again, we have the same message. Social conditionalities need to be attached to those resources. So yes, resources are urgently needed for construction, reconstruction, for training, for development, for trade unions to do their business, but also for society there. That funding critically important, but that funding needs to be spent with a labour focus, and the labour focus needs to be built on respect for trade unions, respect for social dialogue, respect for, I would say, a democracy of the workplace. And the unfortunate reality is the martial law having so many restrictions. Trade unions are identifying to us that there's a lot of unnecessary restrictions on their ability to hold meetings and on their ability to carry out their trade union activity. So that was also part of the discussion. What solidarity can we show?
Esther Lynch of the ETUC, thank you so much for this opportunity, and we will talk soon.
You too, Eric. Speak soon. Mind yourself.
Fed up. Yeah. We've been fed up. Structure, discipline, accountability.
Mistreatment, misrepresentation.
Knowledge is power, y'all.
There has to be accountability.
This pandemic of toxic work culture and mistreatment has got to stop.
The podcast for federal employees by federal employees.
What's up? What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Fed Up. I'm your host, Ron Speakman. So without further ado, let's welcome in our guest, a rural carrier with the United States Postal Service from the state of Michigan, Mr. James Brennan. James, welcome to the show, brother.
Thanks for having me on, Ron. Privileged to be able to speak on this episode because you guys do an amazing job on what you do.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, man. Now, James, you actually are in a decent office, right? And have decent management now as opposed to others across this country. Hell, you may even have one of those unicorns in management that I always talk about every now and then, right? Which is very rare, by the way. They do exist, though, right? But I got to ask you this. In general, would you say that the United States Postal Service is a toxic and hostile environment to work in? And if so, who do you think promotes it more? Management and the agency itself, our own coworkers, or perhaps a combination of both?
In general, there are toxic and hostile work environments within the Postal Service. Would I say it's all? No, but it is a pandemic. I think it comes mostly from management that doesn't have the knowledge, understanding, training, or personality to handle being management. Coworkers have issues as well in many places, where some are only looking out for themselves, or they themselves are perpetuating a toxic environment, whether it be because they're on different pay scales, or because I was treated that way, so I'm going to treat them that way. That's a direct quote from a regular talking about how they treat relief carriers.
Wow.
So it happens everywhere. It's any industry out there. You're going to have people that can't handle being management, don't learn to be management, or are unwilling to learn to be management in the proper way.
Right. Absolutely. Unwilling is right. What do you see or encounter, whether it's personally or through helping and advocating for others, that causes issues or hardships for us that obviously exist today that can be linked to that toxic and hostile environment that we just talked about here?
Well, I think the biggest issues that I see going on is lack of information. We see it throughout the Postal Service. Last year at our Mid-States Conference, which covers 12 states here in the Midwest, we had a regional manager of post office operations who came to speak about current things at the post office. He allowed us to ask questions. And my one question to him was, why haven't all the local postmasters been trained on Rex? And his response was, some people choose not to attend the trainings, some choose to attend and do other things, and others actually do participate. So I mic dropped him and said, and why haven't you made it mandatory? And he had no response to that. Speaking of him, he was at our latest Mid-States again this year. Another carrier asked him about my question last year and asked, since you said some choose not to attend and others tune it out, how can we be assured you're teaching them on these new route cuts that are coming? And it's just proof that even regional managers on down to your district and local postmasters have a lack of information. And then I'm sitting in my office and I'm hearing my district manager reaming postmasters across the district about things that are going on, whether it be something on the city side or something on the rural side. It's almost as if they're specifically finding issues to complain about every single day. And that perpetuates the toxic and hostile work environment that we see on the workroom floor, because it stems from somewhere higher. And I haven't figured out exactly how high it goes through the industry, but I'm guessing it's pretty far up there.
That about does it here for us at Fed Up. Please don't forget to like, follow, and share this podcast.
Hello and welcome to School Me, the National Education Association's podcast dedicated to helping educators thrive at every stage of their careers. I'm your host, Natika Samuels. May 17th, 2024 marks 70 years since the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. For many, this iconic Supreme Court case feels like a foundational and permanent part of American society, but today, the promises of Brown v. Board are under attack. My guest today is Daniel Davis, staff counsel for NEA. Together, we're discussing 70 years of Brown v. Board in America and what the future holds for the promises of that case. Thank you so much for joining us today, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.
So I think we should start with setting the stage of what the state of America was before the U.S. Supreme Court actually gave their opinion on this case.
Yes, so excited to talk with you today about this case as we commemorate the 70th anniversary. Prior to Brown versus Board of Education, Americans essentially lived in an apartheid state, which folks should understand or might understand to be a system of segregation and discrimination on the basis of race. There were several steps that this country took towards this system of segregation and discrimination. One of those steps came in the form of Black codes, which were laws that were passed mostly in the American South, starting around 1865. And these Black codes dictated most aspects of Black people's lives, including where they could work, where they could live, and it ensured Black people's availability for cheap labor after slavery was abolished. So fast forward a few years, another major step towards the system of segregation were Jim Crow laws. And these were a series of laws that were passed, again, mostly in the American South, through which legislators segregated everything from schools to residential areas, public parks, theaters, pools, phone booths, jails, and even cemeteries. This system of racial segregation and discrimination was also sanctioned by the United States Supreme Court in an 1896 case called Plessy versus Ferguson. I think it's fair to characterize this decision as repugnant and really disgusting. Essentially, what the court did was sanction Jim Crow laws that enforce racial segregation by finding that Louisiana's, quote, separate but equal, end quote, law was constitutional.
So skipping forward to the case itself, what did the U.S. Supreme Court rule in Brown versus Board?
In Brown versus Board, the court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, first of all, and it unanimously declared that segregating students on the basis of race, even if the physical facilities and the educational resources are equal, is unconstitutional. Specifically, what the court concluded is that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal, quote, has no place, end quote, and that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and thus violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. This case is widely seen as a historic or landmark case, the case that began the end of racial segregation in America, certainly in schools, and a case that for the first time afforded Black children access to the same educational opportunities as white children. According to some research that I did, in 1988, that is the year that school integration reached its all-time high. But that was even a mere 45% of Black students in the United States attending majority white schools. So we hit all-time high integration in 1988, but even that all-time high was only 45%.
Right, because I was actually going to ask what the sort of standard of integration is. Like, are we saying that there's one Black student in a mostly white school, or are we talking about 20% of students are non-white or Black?
Unfortunately, I don't think that there is a commonly accepted definition.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what a lot of civil rights advocates and legal scholars have been sounding the alarm about is actually the trend towards resegregation. And the way that they define that are schools in which students are racially isolated. where one race is a majority of the students in that school. In most cases, we're talking about school districts in which Black and Brown students go to school with almost exclusively with other Black and Brown students, or in some cases, students who are socioeconomically more disadvantaged. It's a really alarming trend that has been happening really since the 90s. But I think our inability to come to some consensus about what it really means to have diverse, integrated schools is one of the ways that we've really failed to deliver on the promise of Brown.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single episode of School Me. And take a minute to rate the show and leave a review.
This is the Labor Exchange on KGNU FM 88.5 Boulder, 1390 AM Denver, and 98.7 FM Fort Collins. Find us online on KGNU's website and your favorite podcast app by searching for KGNU Labor Exchange. I'm your host, Robert Lindgren, with the Colorado AFL-CIO and Denver Newspaper Guild, Local 37074. Our guest today is Kirsten Forseth, lobbyist for the Colorado AFL-CIO. The Colorado legislative session just wrapped up. So this past Friday, you and I were down in beautiful Pueblo, Colorado for a bill signing on House Bill 1030 on rail safety. But, want to talk a little bit about passing that and what it accomplished, a little bit, about that bill.
Yeah, so the bill was introduced in a very different form than it passed, which ends up happening a lot in the legislature, much to the chagrin, I think, of advocates who are looking in from the outside. They're like, why didn't this pass? They want it exactly the way it was introduced. We introduced the bill to include 5 elements, which had increasing the number of wayside detectors. They needed to put them every 10 feet. So wayside detectors are these little devices that sit on the track and determine whether or not there's dragging equipment or if the equipment's heating up. And that alerts the crew member that they need to usually stop the train and go check to see if there's any sort of problem before a derailment can happen, which dragging equipment and heating are the 2 leading causes of derailments. So we had wayside detectors in there. We had 8,500 feet was the longest a train could be. We allowed for union access to a site so that the union that is representing the rail that is involved in any sort of accident, a union representative could be on site, because we have found that frequently it's the worker that's getting blamed for accidents by the company, and the company's only doing the investigation. No one else is on the site to be able to say what has happened. The NTSB frequently does not deploy to derailments, including the other day where there was, last week, where there was a huge explosion with a derailment. NTSB did not deploy for that, which means there was no union representation and there was no outside third party witnessing what had happened. So they do their own self-investigations. The last part was regarding crossings, railroad crossings, and that one we prohibited railroad crossing from blocking an area for more than 10 minutes. That one ended up, while we still believe that it's not preempted, there's a lot of concerns about the 10th Circuit and how they would rule on that and how that could impact a bunch of other states' laws. So once it goes to an appeals court, it could impact multiple states and what laws they have on their books. So we decided to pull that 10-minute stop issue out and ended up implementing some Florida language that basically says if there's an emergency vehicle, there must be a way for the emergency vehicle to notify the crew that they need to either separate or move forward or backward in order to let emergency vehicles through, which has been a real problem. BNSF and UP, of course, have fought regulation both federally and in any state. So their opposition was problematic, mostly for the governor's office, who had concerns about preemption, as we discussed before, the 10th Circuit issue affecting other states, but also trying to figure out how Colorado can move forward with rail, passenger rail as well. So if we're having this not just an adversarial relationship, but a litigious relationship with Union Pacific and BNSF, that it could derail plans for, look at that pun, that was so cute, derail plans for how we want to roll out passenger rail and mountain rail in Colorado. So I think there was a point of realizing like how we could really not necessarily make the rail companies happy, because of course they want nothing out of this, but how we could essentially kind of bring the temperature down and figure out how to establish something that was even stronger than the bill we had introduced and could survive a challenge through this 10th Circuit. So instead, we revamped the bill to include an Office of Rail Safety, which will include inspections of rail and facilities in order to report those to the FRA. The Federal Rail Administration, if they decide to pass, then the state can go ahead and enforce provisions to ensure safety in the state. So while we're dealing with freight in this bill, it really will help passenger rail also be safe in the future, because they'll be running on the same lines.
Well, thank you so much, Kirsten, for being on the Labor Exchange today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. I appreciate it.
This has been the Labor Exchange on KGNU.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1883. The eighth wonder of the world, the Brooklyn Bridge, opened for traffic. 600 men worked on the project, which took 14 years to complete. Between 20 and 30 men died working on the bridge. This included the bridge's designer, German-born John A. Roebling. Roebling was visiting the site, taking compass readings, when his foot was accidentally crushed. And although his toes were amputated, he later died of tetanus. Some of the most harrowing work for the project had to be completed under the East River. The bridge's stone towers were to stand on top of caissons. These were wooden boxes with no bottoms that would be filled with concrete. Men known as sandhogs had the job of digging until they hit bedrock to rest the caissons. The underwater boxes were dimly lit by gaslights. If the sandhogs came up too quickly, they risked getting the bends. A 15-year-old Irish immigrant described the work saying, "When the air was fully compressed, the door of the airlock opened at a touch, and we all went down to work with pick and shovel on the gravelly bottom. My headache soon became acute. The 6 of us were working naked to the waist in a small iron chamber with a temperature of about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. In 5 minutes, the sweat was pouring from us, and all the while we were standing in icy water that was only kept from rising by the terrific air pressure. No wonder the headaches were blinded." Due to this incredible labor, the bridge finally opened. In the first 24 hours, 150,000 people crossed the new bridge. More than 125 years later, the Brooklyn Bridge still stands as one of the most iconic man-made structures in the U.S. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2.
And that is going to do it for this week's edition of the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly. Just a tiny sample of the amazing programs aired over the last week on more than 200 labor radio and podcast shows. They're all part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, shows that focus on working people's issues and concerns. We've got links to all the network shows, laborradionetwork.org. You can also find them. Use the hashtag LaborRadioPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hey, you can be part of the network too, and you don't even need a microphone. Labor Radio Podcast Network t-shirts are now available. They're union made, and you'll find them in all sizes and 2 colors at laborradionetwork.org. This podcast is recorded under a SAG-AFTRA collective bargaining agreement. The Labor Radio Podcast Weekly was edited this week by Patrick Dixon. I produced the show, and our social media guru is Mr. Harold Phillips. For the Labor Radio Podcast Weekly, this has been Chris Garlock. Stay active and stay tuned to your local Labor Radio Podcast show. We'll see you next week.